Alright everyone, thank you for waiting. As promised, this should be going up within 24 hours. It's a continuation of the last video. Originally, I wanted to cover all of chapter 1160 in one video, but this time I decided to do something different and start with a single video focused on just one theme. That said, this chapter in particular has a lot of points that really need deeper explanation, especially around the Japanese nuances, like Gunko's title from 38 years ago. So in this video, I'll be diving into these details. By the way, I also made a separate video on another channel where I break down some basic Japanese grammar in the simplest way. If you are interested, check the description and give it a watch. In this chapter, Blackbeard's mother was revealed, and the first thing that really stands out is her facial features. Her eyes and facial features clearly resemble Olivia and Robin. Of course, that alone doesn't prove she's connected to Olivia's bloodline, but when you think about Blackbeard's fascination with archaeology, the possibility feels very real. The people of Ohara were labeled as devil, Akuma, because they studied the history of the void century. So if Teach's mother really did come from the same lineage as Olivia, it's not hard to imagine that she too had a passion for history and carried out research of her own. In that case, from the perspective of the celestial dragons, she would also have been a devil. And here where it gets even more interesting. According to Robin, Davy Jones was said to be caused by the devil. That suggests a deep and unavoidable link between the Davy clan and this woman as well. Come to think of it, the very first time we ever got the explanation about Davy Jones was from Robin. Maybe that detail is clue that Olivia's bloodline itself has some connection to the Davy family. Also, the fact that scholars of the void century were called devil might tie into the wall murals in Elbaf from that period, which actually depict devils. Without realizing that Imu-chan, the very leader of the Celestial Dragons, may have the ability to transform into devil-like being, the Celestial Dragons twisted history. As a result, many of them probably came to believe that the D-clan, the Davy clan, the Buccaneer were directly linked to those devils. By the way, we still don't know if Nico is actually Olivia's family name or the surname of husband she might have married. In Japan, widows can choose whether to keep their spouse family name, pass it on to their children, or return to their maiden name, so either option is possible here. And speaking of the names, let's go back to that band connection. There's also singer Nico from Germany. She was once nicknamed the Priestess of Darkness because of her gloomy lyrics. Honestly, that fits Robin perfectly. She's always the one to say something ominous. Right now, the person in One Piece world who probably has the deepest knowledge of the ancient weapon is Robin. But the other one is Blackbeard. He's most likely already heard about Poseidon and Pluton from Kaido, and given his background in studying history, it's no stretch to think he knows what these weapons really are. That means when Blackbeard eventually makes his move to claim the ancient weapons, Robin's role will be critical. And if it turns out that Blackbeard's mother really is related to Olivia's family, then their inevitable clash over the ancient weapons could be seen as fate. Another detail worth paying attention to is how Gunko was introduced with the title Kami no Jujin. Literally, it means a blade that follows God. And since the text also says Kami no Kishidan o Kakae, retrained by God's Knights, it suggests that this role might be something like a trainee knight, someone being raised and trained by God's Knights themselves. If that's the case, then it's likely that figures like Goring and Shamrock also started out on this position. They probably worked their way up, proved their strength, and eventually became full-fledged member of God's Knights. In this chapter, just like back in chapter 1096, we see Garvin clearly leading the God's Knights. That means even 38 years ago, he was already their leader. But think back to our life about chapter 1137. At that point, the title of Shamrock and Garvin were different. In fact, in some English translations at that time, both were simply rendered as commander. But in the original Japanese, their titles are completely different. Garvin was introduced as Kami no Kishidan Saiko Shireikan, God's Knight's Supreme Commander, right up until the moment he became one of the 5 elders, Gorosei. In contrast, Shamrock's title is Kami no Kishidan Dancho, God's Knight's Captain. Now, of course, title can vary depending on the organization, but generally speaking, a Dancho, which means captain or leader, is seen as the leader of a group, the one actually out on the field giving orders and directing the team. On the other hand, Shireikan, which means commander, especially a supreme commander, usually doesn't fight on the front lines. Instead, they oversee the entire organization, including the captains, from a separate position, giving broader directives. We see a similar title with Dragon in the Revolutionary Army. His role is also Shireikan, commander, which means issues orders to the various armies rather than fighting directly himself. That's probably why so many readers have said Dragon isn't doing anything. So back at God Valley 38 years ago, Garvin was the one personally commanding the God's Knights on the battlefield. That means at the time, he was the captain, Dancho. At some point afterward, though, he headed that role over to someone else and moved up to become the Supreme Commander, Saiko Shireikan. Which raises an interesting possibility. If Garvin later became Supreme Commander, then someone else must have been in that position before him, 38 years ago. The name that came to mind is Shepherd Jupiter. I explained this in more detail in another video on LunaPienArt channel, but if one of the 5 elders were lost in that incident, then Peter may have been promoted to replace him, and at some time, Garvin, who had been captain, would have stepped up into the Supreme Commander's seat. That would have left the captain position vacant, and someone within the God's Knights inherited that spot from Garvin. A new opening would be created. That's likely when Gunko, who was a Kami no Jujin, blade in training, under God's Knights was promoted to full member. And here's a fun twist. Back then, Shamrock was still a baby, yet now, Shamrock is one carrying the title of captain, while Gunko, who haven't really changed in appearance, is still being called by his old role. It's an amusing little irony. By the way, about the name Kami no Kishidan, up until now, it's often been translated into English as Holy Knight. But personally, that translation always felt off to me. I've talked about this in more detail on Patreon, but Holy Knights in Japanese would be written as Sei Kishidan, and Oda Sensei deliberately chose not to use that name. Instead, he went with Kami no Kishidan. This word, Kami, here doesn't have anything to do with the idea of gods in our real-world religions. It's almost certainly referring to the celestial dragons themselves, or more specifically to Imu-chan. And notice how Holy Land Marijor includes a character which means holy or sacred. That's why it's translated as Holy Land. That's a correct use of holy. But for Kami no Kishidan, the accurate translation should be God's Knights or Knights of God. And now, with the latest Japanese release, it seems almost certain that Knights of God is the official intended name. In fact, the official English version currently calls them Holy Knights of God. but I think that was simply the translator's choice. After all, when Gerwig first appeared, the official English version mistranslated his title as God Valley's King. And there are other examples, like when the Japanese text carefully distinguishes between Bakkania Zoku, which means the Bakkania tribe, and simply Bakkania, Buccaneers. But the English version doesn't capture that nuance. Like I pointed out in the previous video, even the fact that Shanks spent part of his early life in the West Blue is something you could only understand by reading the Japanese version. Every time I read the official English version, and I notice that the nuance is always quite different from Japanese original ones. Of course, that's simply because of the language differences. It's not about translator's skill. In fact, if you translate too literally from Japanese, the English version often ends up sounding strange or unnatural. Since the two languages are so different, those gaps in meaning are bound to happen. That's why I make a point of covering those differences here on this channel, LunaPienArt, and also why I share weekly breakdowns of the original Japanese version One Piece on Patreon, giving my perspective of the native speaker. And it seems that a lot of Celestial Dragon came from Arijoa to watch the God Valley tournament. Some of them were even placing bets. In their conversation, they mentioned betting on the clan match with the Shepherd family and on the individual match with Gunko. Earlier, a member of Mama Ear family also used the term Shizoku-sen, clan match, which made me suspect that God Valley tournament was divided into different categories, individual battle and team battles. And sure enough, that prediction seems to have been right. In fact, in another video, I suggested that because the tournament had both individual and team divisions, the number of prizes might differ depending on the category, and that might actually be true. And I also believe Doflamingo was there. 38 years ago, Doflamingo would have been 3 years old enough to have at least some awareness of what was happening. So it's very possible he still has faint memories of this event. Seeing the tournament as a child may have inspired him to later create the kind of games he played with people in Dressrosa. After that, both the Rocks Pirates and the Roger Pirates stormed the God Valley one after the other. We saw almost all major members of the Rocks Pirates, but once again, Ochoku wasn't there. He had stayed behind Hachinosu. I actually covered Ochoku's betrayal and what it could mean for his future in another video, so check that out if you are interested. What's really striking is how disjointed the crew feels. Most of the members are bickering about Shakuyaku, yet Rocks, Kaido and Lilin are all preoccupied with something else entirely. It really shows how fractured the Rocks Pirates were as a group, which is fascinating. That's why it makes sense when Saturn, after seeing the Straw Hat crew protect each other and the fight in sync, referred to them the cooperative type pirate crew. 協力型の海賊団か. He was making that statement in direct contrast to what he had seen from the Rocks Pirate in God Valley. And as for the Roger Pirates, we actually got a detailed look at the God Valley incident in Volume 4 Billion, the booklet that was handed out with film lead. In it, one of the Roger Pirates says, "We stole it, the treasure too." The way he phrased it makes it clear they didn't just take treasure. Like Rocks himself said, there were 3 main prizes to be won at God Valley: Shakuyaku, treasure, and devil fruit. Since most of Roger Pirate's crew were never shown eating devil fruit, we see probably ruled those out. That leaves Shakuyaku. So besides treasure, it seems safe to assume they also took her. And when you think about the fact that Shakuyaku is alive and well today, and living alongside Rayleigh, it makes sense. Most likely, Rayleigh was the one who rescued her at God Valley and helped her escape aboard the Roger Pirate's ship. There's also that scene where Garp is shown hurling the cannonball. Clearly, that was his thing even back then. But what's fun is how it mirrors Luffy's attack during the Gomu Gomu no Thunder scene, when he threw lightning itself. Just like how Dragon's design had shades of Gear 4 Snakeman Luffy, here we see that same sense of bloodline connection. And young Roger, as always, gives off a vibe that somehow reminds you of Ace. That's about where I wrap up today's video, but I'm sure you've noticed. I still haven't talked about Dragon at all in this video. And honestly, I've got so much more I want to say about him, so I'll save that for another video. Besides that, I also spotted some interesting Japanese expressions and details in some few scenes. I'll be sharing those thoughts over on my Patreon page, so if you are curious, make sure to check it out. You'll probably see it roll at the end here, but I also make original wanted poster for my members. Putting those together and keeping track of everyone's name takes a bit of time, so I've limited how many people can join each month. If you're interested, I recommend jumping in as soon as possible. And of course, on Dawn Dusk channel, I keep putting out fresh new theories, so don't miss them. Also, I offer private Japanese lessons as well as translation and marketing work in Japanese. So if that's something you are looking for, feel free to reach out to me on Instagram or by email. Alright then, I'll see you in the next video.